Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's good to be back at the MacGill School. And Joe, congratulations. I don't know where you get the energy from, all those years and decades, but it's a fantastic and extraordinary personal commitment that you bring to animating this event with your committee here every year. I feel like the fellow who should say, "Teacher, the dog ate my homework," and sit down. But I better not do that. I want to take one or two of the issues we've had just to kind of do the double yellow line, to emphasize a little bit and to add one or two little bits of detail by way of colour. The key thing is that the clock is ticking. That's not an empty phrase. On the 29th of March of this year, 9 months after the British referendum, once the Article 50 was notified, the clock is ticking. And Brendan Halligan is right to underline that Article 50 is treaty law, and one of its provisions is if you haven't done your business in the 2 years, and if you don't extend the period of 2 years, which is an option that I might mention and return to, that there is a cliff. You simply fall over the edge. So the ticking clock is a very real phenomenon. It is possible, under Article 50, that the exiting state, which is the United Kingdom, and the EU 27 could, by unanimity, under that article, agree to extend the 2 years beyond 2019. So this is legally possible. I think it is politically unlikely. The first part of the politically unlikely bit is that if you extend it, the UK, for the period that it is still negotiating, but as a full member of EU, will have to prepare to hold European Parliament elections in the summer of 2019. And it seems to be something profoundly absurd that a state determined to leave should mobilise to elect 73 MEPs to an institution that it plans to quit. And so it seems to me, for that political reason, among others, although it is legally possible, it is politically unlikely. I might add, it was mentioned briefly in his remarks yesterday by Simon Coveney, that the next round of financial bargaining to do with what should be the size of the EU budget, a process known as the medium-term financial framework, will begin to crank up through this period. And if Britain has an extended period as a full but planning to exit member, it will be very difficult, apart from the exit bill, which is difficult, to avoid the difficulty of getting stuck in the middle of the next financial round because they are there still as a full member during the period of extension of Article 50. So I think for these kinds of reasons, although legally the option to extend is there, I think politically it won't happen. Let me just pause and ask the question, what does the cliff edge mean? It means that all of EU law ceases to apply to the United Kingdom, and that as regards trade, the United Kingdom will have to adopt World Trade Organization tariff schedules, because they don't yet have a new trading framework with the EU or with anyone else. And of all the available options for Ireland, for Europe and for Britain, this is definitively the worst option. If you worry about trade and agriculture, and we do, and we're right to do it, it's the one that carries the highest levels of tariffs of all of the likely scenarios. So the falling over the cliff option is highly undesirable for everyone, and therefore something we should work greatly to avoid. Is it possible? Yes, it's possible. But I think it's a possibility we should greatly strive to avoid. The negotiations, and Brendan has described them, are designed in phases and to try to develop legal certainty and to settle, and this was a phrase adopted by the EU 27, the disentanglement of the UK from the EU. Let me just give you an idea of some of the stuff that comes. We've already talked today about the reciprocal rights of citizens, a major issue and one that will be the subject of today's negotiations in Brussels. The honouring of the UK of its outstanding financial commitments. The written statement of the House of Commons is the official statement of British public policy, and Boris Johnson's meanderings are posturing, but the posturing can impact the official. And so it's an area of balance that needs to be looked at when the balance is struck. The special circumstances of Ireland in all of its manifestations, that is there. But the other kinds of issues that need sorting out, and this is just an illustration, by no means exhaustive. It includes the exit of British members from all EU institutions, including the European Parliament, the European Commission, the European Council, the European Court of Justice, the European Court of Auditors, the European Investment Bank, the European External Action Service, and lots more. There are lots of other EU institutions. It includes negotiations on relocating the European Banking Authority and the European Medicines Agency, both headquartered in the UK, but highly unlikely to stay there if the UK has divorced and is no longer a member state. It includes something which the British have now upped the profile on, which is the treatment of Britain's paid-up capital in the European Investment Bank. If you're going to have a divorce, your lawyer is looking at what are the assets and what are the liabilities. And if Britain has a package of exit liabilities, 100 billion gross, or whatever the sum came out to be, it's also radar scanning for what assets does it have. And one asset is paid up capital to the EIB, and the EIB, when it is paid up capital, can expand credit substantially, and people like us look to the EIB for expanded credit for things we want to do, and the Minister told us that last night. This is not a trivial issue, and one that I think we should keep a very close watch on. And the better the quality of the EIB UK post-exit relationship, the better it is for credit creation, the better it is for the kinds of wishes we might have, and that Europe needs to do with upping its overall investment level. It also includes the orderly disengagement of the UK from international treaties signed by the EU, of which many, including at least 53 free trade area agreements between the EU and others, of which the UK is a beneficiary, and which accounts today for more than 85% of all UK trade flows. So they are going to unplug themselves from the EU, which accounts for over 50% of their exports, and from the EU free trade agreements to be replaced by other, quote, better agreements. Let's wait and see what happens on all of that front. The Euratom Treaty is a big complication because Britain is a big user of nuclear, big reprocessor of spent nuclear fuel. Euratom Treaty has covered all of that 100% technically, officially, legally, imports and exports, all of that. A huge complication, and one now getting some second thoughts. And it includes all sorts of agreements on privileges and immunities to do with the different institutions in each other's states. It includes, as we've seen, fisheries policy with the abrupt announcement by Mr Gove a week or two ago, and the question of territorial waters. It includes dispute resolution mechanisms regarding the interpretation of the withdrawal agreement. What if there's a row, who settles it? And if you won't let the ECJ do it, who do you agree should settle it if there is a row? It includes even things, and Mr Barnier recalled this in Dublin, pets passports. 250,000 pooches and pussycats who vacation with their British owners in Europe every year have EU passports, but they will become British pooches and pussycats after the withdrawal and would be subject to quarantine at the border. And when you bring it down, these things are very real. And it's very real when you arrive with your pet and you're told it has to go into quarantine for so many months and so on. And it simply wasn't thought about because you go and you're ill and you don't have an E111 form. Make sure you're well insured. All of those issues are there. Your kids want to study somewhere else. Do they have to pay much more because they're third country nationals and not EU nationals who are treated with equivalence? You get a certificate in Britain to qualify you for X. Will it be mutually recognised across the continent in the future as it is today, and vice versa? All those things are in there. As regards the negotiating process, in between those summit meetings, which Brendan referred to, we'll have General Affairs Council. Simon Coveney and his equivalents will be sitting in on a monthly basis, reviewing all of this politically, preparing the politics of the summit meetings. So we are there. We are there on a constant basis through our governmental role in that regard. Let me come to the position papers. I'm not going to list them, but there's now more and more position papers published and on the web, published by the British, published by the Europeans. The ones being discussed this week are citizens' rights. Just a quick quote on that. Some of it could be posturing, but it is a reminder, and a real reminder, of the European Parliament's power of veto. Because of the differences between Britain's offer and Europe's expectations about citizens' rights, Guy Verhofstadt and all the people on the Parliament Steering Committee last week signed articles in media across Europe, I quote, saying Parliament will reserve its right to reject any agreement that treats EU citizens, regardless of their nationality, less favourably than they are at present. And there are divergences between the British view and the European view as we speak. Moreover, they said, to underline what I remarked earlier, quote, we will not support any extension of the deadline, that's the Article 50 deadline, at the end of March 2019, because it would require the UK to hold the European elections in May 2019, quote, that is simply unthinkable. So these things are already out there.
5 minutes, Pat.
Thank you. On the British side, Marion touched on some of the issues that are arising in the internal British debate. One thing I want to say, which is maybe against the grain of this morning, but is positive and worth recording, that if we're talking about a future framework for trade relationships, unlike all the other trade negotiations between EU and Canada, Japan and wherever, the negotiation will start from a point of regulatory compatibility because the EU and the UK are already in the same space to do with law. The knotty issues are what happens when the laws diverge over time. How do you resolve disputes, and how do you avoid dumping and state aids and lowered environmental standards or whatever? Those are the hard bits. But the grand plan is starting with compatibility, which in principle could make it a little bit easier. Of course, it's complicated, and Sir Ivan Richards, the former British ambassador to EU, who talked about speaking truth to power in his valedictory note to his staff, challenged what he called, and I quote, ill-founded arguments and muddled thinking in London. The top politicians didn't want to hear what he had to say, and he quit at the beginning of this year. On the politics, the repeal bill that was published and the other bills that Marion referred to, let me just give you an idea of the scale of what all this is. There are, according to your lex, the lexicon of EU law, over 12,000 current EU regulations. There are over 6,000 directives built up over the lifetime of the communities. There are 7,900 UK statutory instruments that have implemented EU law. This is not a trivial thing. This is Mount Everest. And the administrative and political bandwidth to climb Mount Everest, with all the politics that has been mentioned, is a serious question against the timescale there. And Labour, I would say don't look to the Labour Party to rescue this. Labour has been very clear and careful, including Keir Starmer, who's been quoted today. Yes, Labour wants to question workers' rights. Yes, Labour wants to talk about keeping the Charter and fundamental rights. Yes, they want to talk about the extent of the use of discretionary statutory instruments in the Henry VIII powers. Yes, they want to talk about the role of devolved governments. Yes, they want to lighten up somewhat on Court of Justice, which would be really big. Staying in the single market, silent. Leaving the customs union, silent. The big ticket issues that worry us, the Labour Party is stum. What they are doing is gaming themselves to be largely in the Brexit bed, but to have some differentiation in case someone accuses them of being like-minded with the others. And finally, and I will wind up with this, Chairman, are there straws in the wind, other voices? Of course the answer is yes. The question of how to disengage, the length of a transition period, listening to the voice of British business, the Chancellor Philip Hammond is very much pushing this, and you can see the pushback against them from leaks in the media and so on. There's a big battle going on inside. They may well opt for a transition period, and it may well have some of the characteristics we now know as a way of easing the process of going from being fully in to being largely, probably, fully out. You have the voice of Ruth Davison in Scotland, who started with one Tory MP and ended up with 13. and who would like to see Britain softer and not harder on this thing, and they have votes. And you have Tony Blair's voice from the margins, which I think perhaps is a bit off-centre to do what is there. But in the end, Britain is a country divided. It's led by a weakened Prime Minister who's leading a cabinet divided. The Tories in government, and indeed the Labour Party in opposition, are still haunted by their internal European debates between sceptics and pro-Europeans. Clock is ticking, time is running out, the EU negotiating mandate is agreed. Britain must choose now what kind of exit Britain wants, and could there be all sorts of arrangements with Northern Ireland? One would hope yes. But one big question about that platform is, will Britain negotiate on the basis of being a unitary state for the entire territory of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland, or will it permit differentiation? So there needs to be a very big debate with the British, because if Britain allows one part of the kingdom to go a separate way on this, could it prompt the very disintegration of Brendan's final hypothesis about Scotland or perhaps Wales also? So the questions of what are at stake for Britain are profound and cannot be assumed simply because the noises from London, Brussels or Dublin are coterminous at the stage we currently find ourselves at.